You see something impossible, a shooting star, a surprise you never saw coming, a moment so big your mind can't process it fast enough. And before you've even decided to speak, three words are already out of your mouth. Oh my God, you didn't plan to say it. You might not even believe in God. And yet there it was, faster than thought, faster than choice. The real answer for why is far stranger than habit. It has almost nothing to do with religion and almost everything to do with how your brain is wired to handle moments too big for ordinary words. Start with a basic fact about language. Not all speech works the same way. Most of what you say is planned. You choose your words, you build a sentence, you decide what to communicate before it leaves your mouth. Think about the last email you wrote, or even the last text message. You revised it, maybe just slightly, before hitting send. That's ordinary language. It passes through a filter. But a small category of speech doesn't work like that at all. Linguists call these interjections, and one of the researchers who studied them most closely was a linguist named Anna Wierzbicka. Wierzbicka argued that interjections like ouch, wow, and oh my god aren't really sentences at all. They're something closer to a direct readout of an internal state, fired off before the slower, more deliberate parts of your brain even get involved. You don't construct oh my god, it escapes. This distinction matters more than it sounds like it should. Most human language runs through regions in the brain responsible for grammar, vocabulary, and deliberate sentence construction. But exclamations and involuntary speech appear to run through older, faster circuitry, tied more closely to emotional processing than to language planning. A psychologist named Timothy Jay spent much of his career studying swearing and involuntary exclamations, and his research points to something remarkable. People who suffer damage to the language centers of the brain, severe enough that they lose the ability to form normal sentences, often retain the ability to curse or exclaim fluently. Some patients with aphasia, who can no longer produce ordinary speech at all, can still blurt out a sharp expletive when they stub a toe. Something about exclamatory speech survives even when the rest of language collapses. That tells you it isn't stored in the same place as your everyday vocabulary. It's older, more automatic, and more deeply wired. This same pattern shows up in an unrelated condition called Tourette syndrome, where involuntary vocal outbursts, sometimes including curses or exclamations, occur completely outside conscious control. Neurologists studying Tourette syndrome have found that these outbursts are linked to a part of the brain called the basal ganglia, a region involved in automatic, habitual actions rather than deliberate planning. Put these threads together, and a picture starts to form. Somewhere in your brain, there's a fast lane for speech, one that bypasses the slow, careful process of choosing words and fires off a reflexive vocal reaction when something overwhelms you. Pain triggers it, shock triggers it, and apparently so does amazement. So why God specifically? Why not some other word entirely? This is where things get even stranger, because this pattern isn't limited to English and it isn't limited to religious people. Versions of it show up across an enormous range of languages and cultures, from Spanish's Dios mío to French's mon Dieu to countless other languages that reach for a divine or supernatural reference at the exact moment words fail. This cross-cultural consistency is a big clue. If it were just a leftover habit from religious upbringing, you'd expect it to disappear in cultures with less religious influence, or in people who were never raised religious at all. It doesn't. Self-identified atheists say it just as reflexively as devout believers. Something deeper than religious belief seems to be driving the pattern. This is where the psychology of awe becomes relevant. A researcher named Dasha Keltner has spent decades studying awe as a distinct emotional state, separate from ordinary happiness or surprise. Keltner's research describes awe as the emotional response to something that overwhelms your existing mental models, something vast, unexpected, or beyond your ability to immediately make sense of. Historically, before science offered explanations for storms, eclipses, births, deaths, and vast landscapes, nearly every culture on Earth attributed overwhelming, incomprehensible experiences to divine or supernatural forces. Awe and religious experience were, for most of human history, functionally the same category of feeling. Your brain didn't have scientific amazement and religious amazement as two separate boxes. It just had one box, and for most of human history, that box was labeled God. There's also something worth noting about why the divine specifically won out as the default vocabulary for overwhelming amazement, rather than some other category of intense language. Awe, as Keltner's research describes it, isn't just intense. It carries a specific flavor, a sense of being small in the presence of something vast, something that operates by rules beyond your control or full comprehension. That particular flavor overlaps almost perfectly with how religious traditions across the world have historically described encounters with the divine, whether that meant a thunderstorm interpreted as the anger of a sky god, a birth interpreted as a miracle, or a sunset interpreted as evidence of intentional design. Fear-based exclamations reach for danger words. Pain-based exclamations reach for curse words. But when the feeling is overwhelming and vast, rather than sharp and immediate, the vocabulary that happened to already exist for exactly that texture of feeling was religious vocabulary, because for most of recorded history, religious explanation was the only framework available for the vast and the incomprehensible. Even people who grow up with essentially no religious exposure at all often pick up the phrase secondhand, through media, through peers, through the sheer cultural saturation of the expression, long before they've formed any opinion about religion whatsoever. This is different from most vocabulary. Ordinary words get replaced constantly as culture shifts, but this particular linguistic slot has proven unusually resistant to replacement, precisely because it isn't operating in the part of language that responds to cultural fashion. It's operating in the part that responds to raw emotional intensity, and that part changes far more slowly than everything else. Language tends to keep old labels long after the reasoning behind them fades. Think about how many phrases survive centuries after their original meaning stopped applying. You still dial a phone number, even though nobody has touched a rotary dial in decades. In the same way, the linguistic reflex for overwhelming amazement got permanently linked to divine language, back when divine language was simply the only available vocabulary big enough for the feeling. Even now, in a largely secular culture, when something overwhelms you fast enough to bypass deliberate thought, your brain reaches into that same old linguistic slot. Not because you believe in God in that moment, because that slot was built first and nothing has fully replaced it since. Consider how consistent this pattern really is once you start looking for it. In Arabic, overwhelming moments often produce Ya Allah. In Hebrew, variations of Elohim or Adonai serve a similar function. In Hindi, exclamations invoking Bhagwan appear in equally reflexive contexts. Even in officially atheist states, where religious language was actively discouraged for generations, older exclamatory phrases referencing God or fate often persisted in everyday speech, passed down as linguistic habit even after the religious meaning behind them had been politically and culturally stripped away. Governments can ban religious institutions. They have a much harder time banning a reflex. There's a reason no purely secular replacement phrase has taken over completely, despite centuries of increasing secularism in many parts of the world. New exclamations do get invented constantly. Slang shifts generation to generation. But truly overwhelming involuntary exclamations tend to resist replacement because they aren't chosen the way slang is chosen. Slang is learned deliberately, through social exposure, and it changes as social groups change. Involuntary exclamations get wired in early during childhood language acquisition, often before a person has fully formed their own beliefs about religion at all. Developmental linguists who study how children acquire exclamatory speech have found that interjections tend to enter a child's vocabulary remarkably early, often before the child has developed the more complex grammatical structures needed for ordinary sentences. A toddler will say, "uh-oh," or "wow," long before they can construct a full sentence about what happened. This early entry point matters because it means exclamatory phrases get absorbed the same way a native accent gets absorbed, through pure imitation with no filtering for logical or theological consistency. A 3-year-old repeating, "oh my God," after hearing a parent say it in surprise isn't making any claim about the existence of a deity. They're copying a sound pattern that reliably accompanies a certain emotional intensity, the same way they'd copy a gasp, or a sharp intake of breath. By the time that child grows into an adult capable of forming their own religious or irreligious worldview, the phrase has already been running on autopilot in their nervous system for 2 decades or more. This also explains why swapping in a secular substitute rarely sticks under real emotional pressure. You can consciously train yourself to say, "oh my goodness," or "oh my gosh," in calm, controlled situations. But in a moment of genuine shock, when the fast circuitry takes over instead of the slow, deliberate one, the substitute often gets abandoned entirely, and the original phrase comes rushing back out unfiltered. This is the same reason people who've spent years successfully avoiding curse words in polite company will often blurt one out the instant they hit their thumb with a hammer. Conscious control governs planned speech. It has far less authority over the reflexive kind. So the phrase surviving in you isn't really about religion at all, even though it sounds religious. It's a linguistic fossil, a leftover artifact from an era when human beings didn't have any other category big enough to hold pure amazement except the language of the divine. Every time it escapes your mouth faster than you can think, you're not making a statement about your beliefs. You're triggering a piece of ancient circuitry that existed long before your particular beliefs did. One built specifically to handle experiences too large for ordinary words to catch up to in time. So the next time you catch yourself blurting it out, at a surprise party, at a shocking headline, at something so beautiful it stops you mid-sentence, notice what's actually happening underneath it. That's not your belief system talking, that's a piece of ancient linguistic wiring. Older than your opinions, older than your upbringing, doing exactly what it was built to do the moment words became too slow to keep up with what you felt. And thank you for watching. If this helped you see something ordinary in a new way, hit like and subscribe. It's what lets me keep bringing these stories to you. Science is the real magic of creation, and there's always more of it hiding in what makes us human.